What's up guys, Tommy Bowyer here from Movie Rind and welcome to the next instalment of the history of comic book films, and today we will be looking at the Age of the Titans, a period from 1978 to 1995 which saw some of the biggest names in comic books go to the big screen. So without further ado, let's get into it. So I don't think you guys need me to tell you how big an impact Star Wars had on cinema. And not just cinema, comic book films were also influenced as well. Now, up until this stage, comic book films were mostly seen as comedy films, only suitable for children really. And a lot of them were starting to people were losing interests. And apart from the cartoon series, not many big screen adaptations for comic book films during this period. However, that changed once Star Wars was released. People wanted sci-fi. And so Richard Donner put together Superman, released in 1978. And it was a critical and commercial success. The slogan for this movie was, "You will believe a man can fly." And of course, looking at this film, a man could fly. And fly really well. This movie was such a commercial success that it renewed interest in comic book films, and as sci-fi was now at the very top of audiences' lists, comic book films thrived during this period. So with the success of Richard Donner's Superman, a lot more comic book films were thrown into production and they were released very quickly. You had Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Swamp Thing, Superman 2, you had loads of comic book films being released, and of course in 1989 a little movie called Batman was released. Now up until this point, you had the Adam West Batman TV series, which was very camp, it was very comedic in tone, not to be taken seriously, although 1989's Batman was the complete opposite. Tim Burton and Michael Keaton pulled that off and showed Batman in a more mature sense, acceptable for adult audiences. And that's the thing about this period. I've called it the Age of the Titans because at this time DC mostly ruled the roost. I mean, you had Superman, you had Batman, while Marvel were kind of struggling to release movies. They did have Captain America released on home video. However, it did not have the success that any of the DC films were making. At this point, DC ruled the roost. They were releasing so many brilliant comic book films. And of course, the Superman got bigger with Superman 2. Batman, of course, you had Batman Returns released. So at this point, I would say that DC were the kings of the castle and Marvel was struggling to get their act together. Now, after the success of a lot of these films, studios started giving the directors complete creative control over the films. And nowhere is this more seen than with the sequel to 1989's Batman, and that is Batman Returns, released in 1992. Now, Warner Bros. Gave Tim Burton, the director, complete creative control over the film. Now, we know nowadays that Tim Burton thinks outside the box on a lot of his films, and that can be really shown in Batman Returns because he gave a more gothic, a more dark, and more adult film than the first Batman movie. And this outraged a lot of audiences, especially parents. Now, a lot of parents who remembered Adam West as Batman, which were very accessible to children, now comic book films were starting to be seen as more adult rather than just for kids. And this angered a lot of parents in the audience. And Warner Bros., they really came down hard on Tim Burton for Batman Returns. They said it was far too dark. Comic book films, they shouldn't be dark. And then I think other films such as The Crow and RoboCop just cemented this idea that comic book films were becoming far too adult and they should really go back to their roots and appeal to children. And this, in what I can see, caused a regression back to the days of Adam West being comedy, when comic book films were not being taken seriously. Now, we had a lot of successful comic book films in this era. However, by the end of the era, it was starting to change again. It was starting to go back to films, comic book films not being taken too seriously, such as Superman 3, Batman Forever. We started to see that there was a bit of a regression, and this harmed comic book film stand-ins in the box office. most of the movies started to become flops because audiences did not want to just see comedy. They wanted to see an adult comic book film. So while at the beginning of this period we saw some great comic book movies and sci-fi allowing for comic book films to reach their full potential, by the end of the period they were starting to regress back to their comedic roots. So in conclusion, the Age of the Titans is when DC ruled the roost. With the success of Superman released in 1978 and Batman released in 1989, so many brilliant comic book films were released in this period. By the end of the era, they started to experiment with making films darker, with examples such as Batman Returns, The Crow and RoboCop. However, due to a backlash from parents in the audience who felt that these movies were not suitable for kids, they started to go back to their comedic roots, which in the end created one of the darkest periods in comic book films history, and I will discuss that in the next one. So thanks for watching, guys. I really do hope you enjoyed this installment in the history of comic book films. Please remember to like, comment and subscribe in order to receive great and maybe even improved quality content in the future, and I will see you in another one. See ya!